So there's one miracle of Jesus, and only one miracle of Jesus, that appears in all four Gospels. And as I've been reading through my Greek New Testament, I was struck by this passage. It's in Mark 6. The other Gospels have it, but I want to spend time in Mark 6, especially because this is what I've recently been studying and looking into. But there's some things here in Mark chapter 6 that I never saw before, and I thought it might be something that you would be interested in too. So I want to share these things with you. Okay, so I don't want to take a lot of time with this, but I want to add this one thing, which I think makes this interesting, because you're looking at things that I'm discussing, things that I hadn't seen in this story before. And one thing that's William Paley, over 100 years ago, he talked about the evidences of Christianity. He wrote a book. People from that were going to the University of Cambridge, I think it was required reading for them. And it's an excellent, excellent book. One of the things he talks about in that book is what's called undesigned coincidences. And this has been developed by other people later on. Jonathan McClatchy and some others have taken hold of this. But we have what William Paley would call here an undesigned coincidence. Now, I mentioned that all four Gospels talk about this miracle. They all talk about this, but they all add different details. Now, an undesigned coincidence is when a Gospel writer will inadvertently confirm a story from one of the other Gospels. This is something that appears from a human standpoint totally accidental. I'll give you this example. Luke 9:10 tells us where this miracle took place. It's outside of Bethsaida. Now, John gives us another detail that Luke doesn't give us. John tells us that when Jesus is specifically telling the disciples to go feed this great multitude, you know the story, the 5 loaves, 2 fishes, he specifically addresses Philip. Now, it's not in that place in John, but elsewhere in the Gospel of John, we are told that Philip is from Bethsaida, the very place that Luke says this took place. So it's not as if John were just trying to confirm what Luke said, he would have mentioned that Philip was from Bethsaida right there. It just so happens that because he's truthfully relaying what he recalls, this seems to be an undesigned coincidence on the part of the Gospel writers. Now, not only so, but it's interesting to find out that later in Luke 10, it makes sense why Jesus says, "Woe unto you, Bethsaida," talking about the mighty works that have done there. This miracle that was so significant, the only miracle in Jesus' ministry to be mentioned in all 4 Gospels, is one of the things that really condemn Bethsaida. So I just wanted to throw that in of things that you might have missed reading through the feeding of the 5,000. So let's get back to the main point here. First of all, in verse 30, the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And so there's an emphasis here we want to put on the word taught. Things that they had taught. A lot of people these days aren't interested in teaching. They want excitement, they want fog lights, they want all sorts of things, but they don't want teaching. But they wanted to tell Jesus what they had taught. Now, they gathered themselves back together because if you look in I think it's about verse 12, he's sent them out. The disciples have gone out. Jesus has sent them out, and they went out and preached that men should repent. And they cast out many devils or demons and anointed with oil many that were sick and healed them. So they've been gathered back. But before this episode in Mark 6:30, Mark chooses to relate a story between those two things. He sort of sandwiches the story between the story of how the disciples are sent out and when they're gathered back together. So they come back to Jesus, but the story in between is about King Herod. And I'll blow up the font a little bit, hopefully, so you can see it better. It's about how King Herod has a feast as well. he has a feast, and the story has to do with John the Baptist, and you know the story. The daughter of Herodias dances for the king, for King Herod. She pleases him well, and he says, ask whatever you want, and I'll give you half of my kingdom, up to half of my kingdom. You can ask anything you want, up to half of my kingdom. And she consults with her mother, and her mother says, give on a platter the head of John the Baptist. And so that's the story, and that's actually important. So there's this feast that's going on for Herod's birthday, and this is sandwiched between the sending out and the gathering together of the disciples. So that will become important here in a bit. All right, and the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus and told him all things, what they had done and what they had taught. And he said unto them, Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place, and rest a while. Now notice the desert. Mark's going to emphasize this several times. In fact, we can see in Mark 31 here, a desert place, right? Mark 32, again, they parted privately in a desert place. For some reason, Mark really wants to emphasize this idea of it being a desert place. Departs to a desert place. And then again in verse 35, a desert place. This is a desert place. So Mark wants to really bring that out. Now, this word desert could be wilderness or solitary place, something like that. But he brings out 3 times, this is a desert place, this is a desert place, this is a desert place. Why does he do that? And they departed, we'll look in verse 32, and they departed into a desert place by ship privately. And the people saw them departing, and many knew him, and ran afoot thither out of all cities. They were enthusiastic to meet Jesus, and went out them, and came together unto him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw much people, and was moved with compassion towards them. This is the Greek word splachnidzomai. He's deeply moved. It has to do with literally it has to do with your inward parts. And so he's deeply moved with compassion. And I really like this phrase here. This is a detail. Now, I told you all 4 Gospels bring out this miracle, talk about this miracle. But this is the only gospel that brings out this little phrase. Why was he having compassion on them? Because they were as sheep not having a shepherd. They were as sheep not having a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Again, the emphasis on teaching here. So many people want everything else but teaching. But Jesus, when he sees these people, and they're a sheep not having a shepherd, and that will create in your mind many Old Testament resonances. You'll think of, I think it was Micaiah, wasn't it, that he had the prophecy that he saw all Israel scattered upon the hills, as sheep without a shepherd. And this is a motif that appears in the Old Testament more than once. But Jesus sees these people as sheep not having a shepherd. And so what does he do? He teaches them. Now remember, he's in a desert place. He's in a desert place. He's in a desert place. And what does he do when all the people are gathered? They've departed so that they could have rest. They've departed because right up here, they were so busy. It says that they were so busy in verse 31. They were so busy that they had no leisure so much to eat. They couldn't even eat because they were so busy. And now here they are trying to get rest in the middle of a desert, and Jesus sees all these people, and he sees them as sheep not having a shepherd, and instead of taking care of his own needs and the needs of the disciples, he begins to teach them many things. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, This is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away, that they may go into the country round about, and into the villages, and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. So Jesus sees this herd, as it were, and steps in as a good shepherd. John 10, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And now they don't have any bread. You know the story. And the disciples, they go to Jesus, and Jesus says, Give ye them to eat, which seems crazy to them. It seems ridiculous. How many loaves have ye? Go and see. And when they knew They say 5 and 2 fishes. And he commanded them to sit all, he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon green grass. Now, not every gospel, in fact, this might be the only one, I'd have to double check, but not every gospel brings out the fact, this vividness that Mark does. Mark wants to say that this is green grass that they're on. And I began to think about that. Why green grass? Why not just he sat them upon grass? Well, again, it struck me, Mark has already emphasized they're in a wilderness. They're in a desert. They're in a desert. They're in a desert. And Jesus has found green grass for them to sit on. But this word sit, that word sit here in verse 39, that's from anaklino. Anaklinai is the reference, the actual form it takes here in the infinitive form. But that word, in the Middle East, during this time, when they would eat, they would usually recline back to eat. So it's literally they're reclining or lying back. It's not just a quick, hasty meal. They're having a feast, a banquet, if you will, and they are lying back, reclining back. And then again in verse 40, he uses a different word that the King James Version translates sit, but it actually has that same, it conveys that same idea. It's not just sitting like we think of sitting, but it's actually reclining. And so it struck me that here they are in the desert, and Jesus finds them as sheep without a shepherd. And then he steps in as the good shepherd. Not only does he teach them, but he makes them to lie down, to recline in green pastures as he feeds them. Now, whether Mark intended the allusion to Psalm 23 or not, many people have read this and thought of how Jesus, the Good Shepherd, has literally taken them to green pastures. Mark wants to say it's green grass. And they sit down by hundreds and by 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and brake the loaves and gave them to his disciples. Now these verbs, blessed, let me highlight that, blessed, break, and gave. All those verbs again appear in Mark. I think it's, I'm alternating between my screen and my physical Bible here. It reappears in Mark chapter 14, where Mark wants to say, or wants to describe for us, rather, the banquet that they had at the Last Supper. Jesus did the same thing. He blessed, he brake, and he gave. So for me, this is a foretaste. This is Jesus showing us that the same one who met with them out in the wilderness is the same one that has given us the Lord's Supper. And honestly, I think it's a signpost that points us on beyond that to the messianic banquet at the last time, when he will make all things new and will sit with his disciples and break bread with them again. Spurgeon had an interesting note on this. He says it was actually in the subtraction that the addition took place, and in the dividing that the multiplication took place. So that he is dividing and breaking the loaves, and it's in that the multiplication takes place. Verse 42 says, and they did all eat and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments and of the fishes. And they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men. And I couldn't help. Again, you might not necessarily see an allusion here to Psalm 23, but I can't help but remember that Jesus, as the Good Shepherd, comes, makes his people to lie down in green pastures, and then not only does he give them good things, he prepares a table for them in the presence of their enemies. Now remember, we talked about how Herod, sandwiched between the sending out of the disciples and the gathering back in of the disciples, is the story of Herod and his banquet. Herod has a banquet, and he's invited all the wealthy people, all the people that can pay him back again. While Jesus, on the other hand, as the good shepherd has called the lame, the weak, the poor, the lost sheep of Israel, and everyone is welcome at his table. And so Herod feeds his own, and Herod should have been a shepherd of those people. In the Old Testament, the shepherds of Israel, the motif of king and shepherd went together. It goes all the way back to the idea of David being shepherd king. Herod was not their shepherd, but they were wandering around, not being fed. And here Jesus, the true shepherd, comes, offering them bread, sustenance, and also feeding them. Now, we shouldn't have a cartoon version of this story. If you've read much about history or know much about history, the Galilean hills were filled with messianic fervor. And so if you take this story on into the book of John, you'll notice that as soon as this happened, the people were ready to take him and make him a king. This is not your child's storybook version of the story. This is real, and it had great implications for the people that were there. Now, we should remember several things here. One is that Christ is the true shepherd. Two, he has compassion on his people. And just like Psalm 23 tells us, when he provides, Scripture says, he prepares a table in the presence of my enemies. Juxtaposition to Herod's great feast for his lords is Jesus' feast out in the wilderness, where he provides for everybody. But not only does he provide enough for them to eat, their cup runneth over. And so Jesus has provided a meal in the desert, led his people to green pastures, and then there is more than enough. In fact, 12 baskets full. Now, I suspect that those disciples took those 12 baskets with them in the next episode, in verse 45, when Jesus sends them. Straightway he constrained them. The idea there is that he almost forced them. He compelled them to get into a ship. And then I'm guessing that those 12 baskets of bread were right there in the ship with them. And if indeed they were, when the storm began to happen, when they were on that ship, you know the story, the winds and the waves began to crash, and they began to become fearful for their life, and they see Jesus walking on the water. And then finally in verse 52, for they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. They were astonished beyond measure when Jesus gets into the ship, and the winds and the waves, they calm down, because they considered not the miracle of the loaves. What struck me about that is, what if they did have that bread right there with them in the boat? They had their miracle right there in the boat with them, and they couldn't see its implications. And you, if you've been changed by the power of God, God's changed you from an old creature to a new creature, there's a miracle that's already happened for you. Don't forget what God's done for you. When the storms and things happen in your life, don't forget, because you have a good shepherd who will take you and lead you into green pastures.